Chapter 6. Hans looked over the bow of the ship and smiled. He had made it! In a little over an hour, his ship would dock in Arendelle's port, and he, Hans Westergaard, 13th, the youngest son of the king of the Southern Isles, would finally have a chance to make a name for himself. He would become the next king of Arendelle, or at least that was the plan. Getting to this point had not been easy. It had taken nearly 3 years to convince the king that he was responsible enough to be the representative to Arendelle when the time came. And when, at long last, news arrived that Princess Elsa was to be crowned Queen of Arendelle, Hans knew his time had come. All the begging, pleading, and generally making himself a lapdog to his father to procure a spot as the representative would pay off. So what if he had never told his father the true reason he wanted to go to Arendelle? He wanted to surprise everyone. He would show his father and his brothers and all the Southern Isles that they had grossly underestimated him. For the past 3 years, Hans had ingratiated himself to his father. Whatever the man needed, Hans did, from the dirtiest of tasks to the most mindless of errands. He had been sent among the Isles to deliver wedding invitations for one of the twins, who had met and wooed a young lady in record time. I still don't know how Runo did it, Hans thought now. My new sister-in-law must seem so much smarter than to fall for his smarmy charms. Hans shrugged. Even now, when he had been given a role of some honor, he couldn't let go of the bitterness of his past. But never mind that, he thought. I'll show them soon enough. Hans might have spent much of his time doing only what his father asked, but he was smart. He knew that if he was to get what he wanted, he needed to take initiative. He needed to make himself the most knowledgeable man in the Southern Isles about the kingdom of Arendelle. He needed to be the preeminent authority on the ins and outs of Arendelle's customs and learn the proper ways to pay respect to their queen on her coronation day. He knew none of his brothers would take the time, and his father's current ambassador was old and gassy. Not someone who should be seen as the sole representative of the Southern Isles. So, in between his tasks, and with Lars's help, Hans had done hours and hours of research on Arendelle and its soon-to-be queen, Elsa. There were plenty of old texts that told of Arendelle in general. Hans had learned that it was a beautiful kingdom with a peaceful history. Nestled at the base of a high range of mountains, it was safe from invasions. The only way into the kingdom was by sea. The ports of Arendelle were known for their fair trade, and the kingdom, while not exceedingly rich, was quite comfortable. The queen would want for nothing. If what Hans had seen in the books was true, the kingdom was a place where darkness and evil were not known. Elsa, however, Hans thought the ship sailed closer and closer to the port, was still a mystery. There wasn't even a picture of her. For all Hans knew, she could be 8 feet tall, or bald, or have a fanatical interest in rock collecting. The only thing he had learned for sure was what Lars had told him that long ago day. She never left the castle, ever. No matter what sort of queen lay in wait for him inside Arendelle's castle, Hans knew he would find a way to become her king. He had worked too hard for there to be any other outcome. Hans remembered the day he had received news that Princess Elsa was finally to be crowned queen. He had just returned from a rather unpleasant visit to a village late on paying its taxes. It was time to give the king a full report. Father, Hans had greeted the king, bowing his head, the village has been warned and their punishment completed. I don't think you should have any problem with them in the future. And what about their taxes? Were you able to collect? Hans suppressed a shudder. From most of them, yes. The ones who could not provide what they owed paid in other ways. Hans dropped a bag of coins in front of his father. This is the money. The other payments I disposed of. Bile had risen in his throat as he thought about the payments. Still, he had done what he had to do. Thank you, Hans, the king had replied. As always, his eyes were distant. But this time, Hans couldn't help noticing that the man's tone wasn't as cold or dismissive. Perhaps this was his chance? Father, Hans had begun, hesitant. The king raised an eyebrow. I have taken it upon myself to put together a list of potential issues that need to be discussed with the new Queen of Arendelle after her coronation. I have spoken to several people recently back from trips to the kingdom, and it is said she will only open the gates for 24 hours. Initiating any new agreements and negotiations of terms must be done during that time. I know that you are far too busy to go yourself, with Prince Bruno getting married soon and the arrival of another grandchild, and I know my presence is not required at either of the events. He paused, hoping his father might actually disagree, but his father didn't say a word, so Hans went on. I thought it only fitting that I made the trip to Princess Elsa's coronation as the representative of the Southern Isles. Reaching into his jacket pocket, Hans had pulled out a detailed scroll, complete with talking points and a clear itinerary. He held it out to his father. Taking the paper in his hand, the king studied it for a moment. Then he looked up at Hans. I'm surprised by your interest in such a small, distant kingdom. Well, father, as you always say, a kingdom is only as strong as its allies. I thought it best to ensure an alliance with Arendelle. His father looked thoughtful. And you feel confident you know what needs to be done? He asked. Hans nodded. Well then, the king said, shrugging, I don't see why it should not be you. You have shown me you can be responsible, and I shouldn't have needed for your services in the near future if you have done your job well. Take a small ship and your favorite horse and make your way to Arendelle. Secure a new trade agreement and ensure a strong alliance. Yes, father, Hans said, barely keeping the excitement from his voice. When the gates close, return home immediately, the king finished. I'm sure they'll have need of you in the nursery by that point. Your brothers and their wives have quite the habit of reproducing. Then, without another word of goodbye, the king had turned and left. For an instant, Hans had been too stunned to do anything. In one moment, he had been told he could go after what he wanted, and the next he had been cut down. It was so typical of his father. But so what if his father thought little of him now? So what if he only had 24 hours to accomplish his goal? He would surprise everyone, show his father and his brothers what sort of man he truly was. Now, as Hans's ship docked next to one of the long piers that jutted into the water surrounding Arendelle, he let out a breath that it felt like he had been holding since leaving the Southern Isles. All he had to do now was find Princess Elsa and get her to fall in love with him. How hard could that be? As it turned out, finding Princess Elsa proved harder than Hans had anticipated. After disembarking the ship and taking a few minutes, well, more than a few minutes if he was honest, to get his land legs back, Hans had mounted his horse and headed into town. For some reason, Hans had assumed that the town would be quiet in the hours leading up to the big event. He had been wrong. Very, very wrong. It seemed every inhabitant of Arendelle, plus representatives from every kingdom near and far, had packed themselves into the village at the base of the castle. Looking around, Hans saw that the kingdom was as picture-perfect as the books he had read suggested. In the distance, he could see the peak of a snow-capped mountain, but down in the town it was warm. The air smelled of an intoxicating combination of fir trees and sea, the result of a massive forest that lay just behind the kingdom and the water that stretched out in front. Children raced about, their faces glowing, whether parents shopped or gossiped or sold their wares. The streets were clean and the houses well cared for. It was, in a word, lovely. Ruling over this kingdom would not be a terrible job at all. But as Hans carefully maneuvered his horse, Citron, between a cart full of eggplants and another cart filled with what looked like bouquets made out of fish, he began to doubt himself. Did I honestly think I was just going to walk into town and bump right into Princess Elsa? She was probably locked inside getting ready, not out wandering the streets looking for love. Hello, Princess. How wonderful to see you outside the castle gates. A woman's voice cut through the crowd and Hans pulled back out his reins, stopping Citron. Princess? Had he heard right? It is so wonderful to see you, Princess. It's been too long. It seems he had. Whipping Citron around, Hans searched the crowd for the source of the comments. Suddenly, he caught sight of a red and green flash. A moment later, a young woman bounced into view. She was laughing at something an older fruit peddler had said as she paused to inspect the apples on his cart. Nudging Citron forward, Hans got a little closer and tried to listen in without being seen. This is the prettiest, greenest apple I've ever seen, sir. You must bring some up to the castle so cook can use them in her pies. "Oh, princess," the old man said, his wrinkled cheeks flushing as though he were a schoolboy, "you are too kind. I'll go straight away. And here, take this apple. On me. Enjoy." "This is Elsa?" Hans thought as he watched the girl take a bite and continue making her way through the town. Everywhere she went, she was stopped by one person or another, and each time she greeted them with a warm smile and a bit of conversation. Following her, Hans couldn't help being impressed. True, she seemed almost like a newborn colt, all legs and a little awkward, but she was actually rather, well, pretty. Her reddish gold hair was pulled back from her face, and he could just make out a few freckles in her pale skin. Her eyes were lively, and when she laughed, it was contagious. I wonder why the only thing I could find about Elsa said she was a recluse. She seems anything but. Hans shrugged. What did it matter? So the book was wrong, and if this was the woman he wanted to woo and wed, well, Hans could imagine much worse options. But in order for that to happen, Hans had to make an impression, and it seemed now was as good a time as any. He needed to make this good. He needed to seem heroic and poised and powerful all at the same time. How am I going to do that? It's not like I can ride in and save the day like in all those silly fairy tales. Or can I? Noticing that the princess was standing precariously close to the side of a boat that was precariously close to the side of the dock, Hans had an idea. He waited for the princess to turn her back to him. Then, nudging Citron into place right behind the girl, he waited. From what he had seen so far, the princess was rather effusive in her movements. She was bound to swing around at any moment, and when she did, as if by cue, the princess whipped around, her mouth open as if she were ready to burst in a song. Instead, she burst right into Citron's chest. Startled, she let out a cry and stepped back. But the boat was in her way and she toppled into it. The weight of the princess was just what the boat, which had already been ready to plummet into the water below, needed. It began to tip, slowly at first and then faster. Hans heard the princess let out a cry, and then he did exactly what he had planned to do all along. Kicking Citron forward, he had the horse step right into the front of the boat. Instantly, the rear of the boat leveled out. Inside, the princess looked up at Hans. Her eyes were wide with amazement, a little bit of shock, and definitely a whole lot of interest. Hans smiled. That, he thought, could not have gotten better. Princess Elsa of Arendelle was practically his.